The Whitegrass Heritage Project is an effort to document the history of the Whitegrass Dude Ranch, which began in 1913 and is located at the base of the Grand Teton mountain range, just north of Jackson Hole, Wyoming. The Whitegrass Dude Ranch was considered a successful operation in an era when western dude ranches flourished and catered to an eastern clientele who were typically wealthy and well-educated. It was not uncommon for individuals, couples, and families to come and stay at Whitegrass for 4 weeks or longer, and to return year after year. As a result, many lifelong relationships were established between ranch dudes and wranglers. After owner Frank Galey died in 1985, the ranch was abandoned, and the remaining 13 log structures deteriorated. In 2005, the Grand Teton National Park partnered with the National Trust for Historic Preservation to rehabilitate the ranch structures and to transform the former dude ranch into an educational center that would teach the skills needed to preserve historic structures in national parks throughout the western states. The interview that follows documents some aspects of life at Whitegrass, either when it was a dude ranch or what it took to preserve the ranch and turn it into a national park training facility. A generous grant from the Charles Redd Center for Western Studies at Brigham Young University is making this project possible.
All right, today is the 2nd of September, 2014. My name is Matthew Heiss, and I am working as a volunteer for the National Park Service as part of the Whitegrass Heritage Project. And with me today is Sharon Cahan from the Jackson Hole Historical Society and Museum, who's also very interested in Whitegrass history. And together we are recording Cynthia Galey Peck, who is up from Young, Arizona. She is the daughter of Inga Galey and the adopted daughter of Frank Galey. Inga and Frank ran the ranch.
Adopted from both.
Adopted from both. And just for the sake of context, Becky Heiss, my wife, is off to the side indexing this interview as we begin. So Cindy, first of all, thank you so much for making yourself available and for coming up from Arizona for this. I know that you're here for the reunion, but the fact that you've given us a little bit of time today is wonderful. I'd like to start by getting to know your personal background a little bit through your memories of your mom and your grandparents. Why don't we start with that? In fact, why don't we start with your grandparents? Tell me what you remember about them, where they were from, and what they were like.
Maternal or paternal?
Maternal. Maternal. Yeah, we're going to focus on mom's side of the story.
Okay.
Good clarification.
Mother's family, mother and my mother's family came from Germany. And before World War II, mother acted as secretary to her father, who was a business person.
What kind of business was he in, do you know?
At different times, multiple. Before World War I, he had what they called a commune. It was more like a warehouse where he would buy whatever products the camel trains brought to Saudi Morocco.
Wow.
And then the individual merchants would come and buy the rugs or the salt or the whatever it might be.
Was he living down there in the Middle East?
Yeah, he was living in Morocco.
Oh, man. Wow.
And
cool.
Mother was there as a child. Wanda, my grandmother, her sister, whose name just flew the coop, was with her to help take care of the one child, which was Inga. The French overtook Morocco in 1914.
Yep.
The same year the White Grass Barn was finished built.
That's right. That's right.
And Granddaddy was put in prisoner of war camp. Grandmother, mother were sent to Switzerland, and they lived there until the end of the war, and Granddaddy was released.
Wow.
Then he started another business in Germany. At one point it was a shoe factory through the beginning of the World War II. My aunt talks about, at that point, Mother was in the United States. Granddaddy went back to take care of Grandmother and the younger daughter when he felt World War II was starting.
Now that's kind of a bold move to go back to a country that's engaged in a war rather than pulling the family out of a war zone. Do you have any idea why he did that?
I think he was thought he was going to protect his business and protect his family.
Okay. Okay. Interesting.
And but my aunt talks about bicycling out of town. I think at that point they lived in Frankfurt, and trading shoes for food with the farmers. And she talks about going into the farmers' houses to do the trades. And there would be Oriental rugs, there would be china, there would be anything but metal. The Germans took every bit of metal from people's houses to make armaments.
Yeah.
And Grandmother and Granddaddy end up moving to their country property. They had a couple that were retainers, and they offered them to go with or stay in town, and they went with Grandmother and Granddaddy. And I remember Grandmother talking about Granddaddy having a birthday coming up, and she was determined to put meat on the table. So they went and somehow snared sparrows, and she cooked them. And she was so proud to have meat on the table.
Wow. Wow. Now, your grandfather is Ottmar Freitag,
Yes.
and he's buried down here at White Grass.
Yes.
Yeah. So,
And my grandmother died in Connorsville, Indiana, where they stayed winter times with my aunt, mother's sister, Renata.
yeah, Renata, okay. But did your grandparents live here on White Grass, at White Grass during the summertime?
Oh yeah, for years and years. They came over in 48, I believe.
Okay.
At that point, they were trying to get me schooling, and Dad bought two little log cabins and put them about 15 foot apart on Pearl Street.
Here in Jackson, down
Here
in Jackson.
in Jackson, and then built a room to connect them, the back part of which was the bathroom. And one of the parts about building that, I remember wires sticking out of the wall, and I picked up this metal thing and touched the wires. I've been afraid of electricity ever since.
Wow. Wow.
But that was so that they could get me to school in Jackson.
Yeah.
And then Dad would have to come up here almost on a daily basis to shovel roofs.
You know what? We'll talk a little bit more about your education because you told me some interesting things in our phone conversation. So let's get back to your mom. She came to the U.S. before World War II.
Correct.
And was working as a secretary here. Your grandfather goes back, but your mother stays.
Correct.
So talk about...
My mother, just before they went back, my mother married Max Wood, who is from the family in California, which Los Gatos is named after. And the Marble Cats Gateway, one can still see from the freeway.
Yeah.
He had a growth at the base of his brain that was, well, they operated on it and it grew back. And when it grew back, it put pressure on his brain and he threw things. And
Violent? I mean, he became violent?
I guess, yeah. And the puppy went through the
Plate glass window? Oh my gosh.
And his folks, being present, decided they better extricate Mother and myself.
Yeah.
And actually that, according to Mother, that marriage was annulled.
Okay.
But
Now,
I was adopted when they were married. They adopted me when they were married.
so tell me about your father. Was Inga, was your mother married first? Prior to
Yes.
Wood?
No, not prior to Wood.
Okay. Tell me how you came about.
Mother's story, and she liked to tell history the way she would have liked it to be, was that she miscarried again, and the doctors put the live child with the live mother. And I was the live child in Mother's story, and she was the live mother.
Wow.
Since then, I have discovered that my biological mother was at least alive 4 years ago.
Oh my gosh.
Haven't really found her, but I found a little bit of information about her.
Uh-huh.
My biological father died in the 60s.
Okay. Do you know why you were placed with Inga?
She was 18, she was unmarried, and in those days, I'm sure the family just wanted it to go away. And
Yeah.
so,
Yeah. Okay. So was Inga married to
Max Wood.
Max Wood at the time that you were adopted by Inga and Max?
Correct.
Wow. Okay. And so then that marriage is annulled because Max has a violent streak in
Yeah.
him. And as I recall from our conversation, your mom goes up to Oregon.
Right.
Tell us why.
Granddaddy's sister, whom I called Nana, lived there.
Okay.
So she went to Nana.
All right, her aunt's
Right.
house.
And at that time, the cadets were in town,
Mm-hmm.
and that's when she met Frank Galey.
Okay, okay. And then she marries Frank in about 43, 44?
We can probably figure that out from the albums.
Okay, all right.
Yeah,
It's
approximately.
about that time.
Yes,
It's in Oregon.
it's in Oregon.
Okay, all right.
They weren't. They met in Oregon. I believe they were married in New Mexico, and I was adopted by Frank in New Mexico.
That's right. Carlsbad. He goes down there.
They were married in Bisbee, Arizona.
Arizona.
I'm remembering that. But they lived in Carlsbad, and I was adopted in Carlsbad.
Okay. And because at that point, Frank is in the service and he's a pilot.
He's a pilot.
Okay. All right.
They
And-
asked him if he had a choice of bombing Germany or Japan, what would he prefer? And of course, he said Japan. So he never left the United States.
During the war. Yeah. Okay. Well, let's pick up with your mom, and like I said, we'll carry her life through to the end and come back and get Frank. So Inga and Frank are married, and then after the war, come back here to Whitegrass.
Yes.
What was your mom's reaction coming to this very primitive place? I mean, after the war, the electricity wasn't here yet, no telephone yet. Talk about that.
I don't really know. What I remember a little bit later is she was a very gutsy lady. And especially in the early years, since the business here was basically from 4th of July through Labor Day, which is not very much of a year to make a living.
Yeah.
Dad had a hunting camp, and so she was left here by herself a lot to take care of the animals that were here. And at that point we had chickens and pigs and horses and cows and dogs and cats. Sometimes a sundry other animals. Some of the stories I remember of her, especially in winter or when Dad was gone, when I was hooking up the team to go get supplies and mail, get to Moose to shovel out the car, to get to Jackson to get supplies and get back in time to milk the cows. And she had put Snip and Bess, I'll back up just a little bit. Teams work, the right side team works the right side, the left side team works the left side. And if you reverse them, they're totally confused and nothing works well. And she did manage to get from here to Ted Hartgrave's, which is about a quarter mile toward Moose from the junction of the Moose Wilson Road and Whitegrass Driveway. And Ted Hartgrave, and at that point they went off the track, and Ted Hartgrave came out and straightened them up, and she managed to get on in. But she had no animal experience coming here. She was basically raised in cities.
Right.
So it had to have been quite a challenge.
Yeah. Yeah, really. Yeah. So, go ahead.
She drove the team by herself in deep snow?
In the wintertime.
Did she know how to shoot?
Not really.
I was just wondering, Cindy, what the predators were like around it. Do you remember her telling any stories about having to safeguard the stock against wolves or anything like that?
A lot of coyotes around. The dogs pretty much kept them at bay. I don't remember any predators in the wintertime. In the summertime, bear. We had bear problems pretty consistently.
Was it bear because of the animals here, or was it bear because of the garbage dump down the road? Or bear because the dudes or staff were leaving food in the cabins and tents?
No, they were usually go try to get into the kitchen, and so I think some of it was the garbage and just the smell of a kitchen that's cooking for 80 people.
Yeah.
Dad ended up putting, you remember the old metal cots? They had a wire springs for black. He dismantled a bunch of cots and bolted those springs across all the kitchen windows.
To keep the bears out.
Martin. We all had martin in the kitchen frequently.
Yeah.
Porcupine were a problem. And in case you don't know, porcupine don't die easily. At one point, they'd got in the corral behind the barn and were getting quills in horse noses, and it got my ire up, and I grabbed a piece of corral rail and I beat it over the head. It seemed like for 15 minutes before it died. With the quills, it just bounced off. It made
yeah, good protection, huh? Wow.
I mean, it's really extraordinary. So your mother was out here by herself with no previous experience with horses or other animals, and she's hitching up a double team and driving it through heavy snow. There was no handyman. There was nobody.
At times there was nobody. Very early years, Ollie and Twyla Van Winkle lived in what we called the Messler cabin, which was the far north cabin that is not there anymore.
And were they caretakers? Was he wrangler
He was caretaker year round.
Okay.
And he helped shovel roofs and take care of animals, and said that I had bees in my bonnet and ants in my pants. I don't know what that tells you is my childhood. This was preschool.
Okay.
Did your mother ever talk about her feelings about the isolation out here?
Mother did not talk about isolation. She did not talk about feelings. She would not talk about her time in Germany, even with her sister, who was dying to talk about those things.
Do you have a sense why she was that way? I mean, I'm probably asking for unfair psychoanalysis, but, sometimes people are born that way, or my wife is always analyzing me.
Is one's extreme or the other?
Yeah.
I don't really know.
I guess. Did she enjoy it? I mean,
she loved it. She loved it. She didn't love some of dealing with the help and the people. Dad wanted to and did have cocktail parties every single night in his house for the guests.
Mm-hmm.
And that was hard for her.
For her.
I think she was more of a private person than Dad was. Dad was very outgoing, very charismatic. Everybody loved Frank Galey.
Yeah. In talking to Rachel yesterday, we talked about her first impressions of your parents, and some of her staff's impressions of your mom in particular, and they were a little bit intimidated by her because she was a little bit more rigid, a little bit more German. Things had to be so. Is that a fair assessment?
Very fair. She was very rigid.
Okay. Ran a tight ship.
Mm-hmm.
She took care of the business aspect of Whitegrass?
Absolutely.
Okay. And what did that entail? I think you helped her a little bit, or started to learn that. Why don't you talk about that?
Okay. It involved taking the phone calls, making the reservations, billing, figuring out wages for people, tips for people, ordering food, ordering propane, ordering whatever was needed at the barn. Dad was the personality and was supposed to run the barn, but the barn was run collectively by whoever was working here. Sometimes we'd have a strong head wrangler, and other times it just kind of ran itself.
Okay.
With those aspects that happen when things kind of run itself.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Okay. All right. How did your mom get along with? Let's talk first about the staff. The wranglers, the cabin girls, the staff.
She did not make friends with them. She was hard. She had her standards, and she was the boss. She didn't make friends, but she made sure things ran right. I think she was fair, but you had to toe the mark.
I got a sense that she did have a friendly relationship with Rachel, that Rachel was
Yeah.
somehow different than the
Yeah,
younger staff.
I think her German upbringing led her to be very aware of social status. And Rachel came in as a manager.
Mm-hmm.
At first, my parents were horrified because they thought they were hiring a mature person rather than a 21-year-old. They did hire a very mature person. It just happened to be a young, very mature
Yes,
person.
exactly.
And Mother greatly respected that. And Rachel worked extremely well with Mother, and yes, they were extremely close friends.
Yeah.
And, you know, the close friends that Mother had, I could name, you know, on one hand or less.
And were they people in town in Jackson, or were they some of the dudes that came out?
One person that lived in Jackson, they were actually one of Dad's buddies from the Air Force when he married and moved to Jackson, and that was Mimi Crenshaw.
Okay.
And she has great insight in some of my parents' actions. Rachel, definitely. One of them was a guest that lived in the East.
A regular attender, somebody who came.
Actually came to Golden Rock.
Okay. We'll talk about that in a minute.
And there were some good acquaintances, but really friends,
Hmm.
not very many.
So is it fair to say that she just kind of focused on the business and focused on surviving and focused on you?
Focused on the business, focused on Dad. My impression is that when I started getting into school, that she wanted to play with Dad in the winter, find a business for winter time with him, and that had a lot to do with my going to boarding school at 6th grade.
Okay. And is that when they went down to the West Indies and got Golden Rock?
Yeah.
Okay.
I mean, they searched Mexico. Dad couldn't stand the fees
Mm-hmm.
that you needed to continually produce to work in Mexico, to have anything in Mexico.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it was his sister Marion, or Mopsy as we called her, that suggested looking in the Caribbean.
Mm-hmm.
And that's when they found the place in Nevis.
Yeah. Did you get to go down there and see the place?
When I was moved closer to them when they bought Nevis, which meant I went to school in Massachusetts instead of Utah. And yeah, some Christmases I went down.
Okay. All right.
What school did you go to?
Fox Hollow in Lenox, Massachusetts.
I went to Emma Willard.
Oh my gosh.
And I
Small world.
started out in Roland Hall in Salt Lake City.
You just never know what you're going to meet another preppy out here in the wilds.
Well, Roland Hall, our son lives right across the street from Roland Hall.
Oh my gosh. It still exists.
And I walked past the K through 6 Roland Hall on my way to work every morning. And I'm assuming you started in 7th, 8th, 9th grade in Salt Lake?
6th.
6th? Okay. So was it down off of 9th East? Do you remember? Sort of
It
towards
was up
Sugar?
on the hill. It was up on the hill.
Mm-hmm.
Big white house. Encompassed basically a full block. And part of it was used as St. Mark's School for boys. Just as I left, they started that.
Okay.
And I remember walking down like a whole block's worth of steep stairs to get down to the street where ZCMI was.
So you were downtown
In the avenue.
in the avenues. Yeah, that's our neighborhood. I walk past it every day.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, how awesome. So So again, back to your mom. So the business is going, and let's talk a little bit about the divorce and what brought that about, and your perspective of it. Why don't you just kind of talk about that?
His mother felt Whitegrass was Frank Galey,
Yeah.
and so she would take Goldenrock as the other business. And so she ended up with 49 shares of Goldenrock, and the other shareholders were all friends of my dad's. And one of the very weak and small shareholders, mother for a while was able to have him vote with her, so she actually could manage it.
Yeah, maintain her majority
Right.
status. Yeah.
And then they all got together, and one of the very, very strong ones had a meeting, major meeting, without even inviting the primary stockholder, and basically fired her. Bought her out for a pittance.
Mm-hmm.
She didn't even get all of her personal belongings out of the place. And in that period of losing Dad, losing Goldenrock, I was gone and married. She lost that power that she had in her.
Mm-hmm. What happened to her after that? This is about 65, 66?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
She, one winter she went and stayed with Rachel up in Vermont.
Mm-hmm.
Then she moved in with her sister in Connorsville, which she and her sister are just as different as two people can be.
Mm-hmm.
And but it kind of worked. She tried to live with Bill and myself, and that didn't work very well because of Bill, basically.
Mm-hmm.
And then she, well, before that, she had built a little house in Skyline, outside of Jackson, and my first marriage with my kids, we lived there while we built our house just down the hill from Mother's.
Mm-hmm.
And
What was she doing for work to support herself at this time?
when she lived with us in Tucson, she was working at the Tanca Verde Ranch front desk, reservations,
Okay.
doing
the same kind of business things that she
Yeah.
did here at Whitegrass or
not
Goldenrock?
the financial part, but yes, all the front desk
Mhm.
kind of things.
Mhm.
Part of that time, gosh, after Nevis, that's the only job I think I remember her having.
Okay. How'd she wind up down in Arizona? Didn't she go to Payson?
She came to Arizona because I was there.
Okay.
And she, like I said, she lived with us briefly, then bought her own little place, really cute little adobe place.
Mm-hmm.
And then we moved up to Young, Arizona, and so she went back to Connorsville. And then after Uncle Heinz died, Aunt Noddy and my mother came to Young, couldn't stand it, went to Payson.
Couldn't stand Young because it was so remote?
You got it.
Okay. For a woman who lived here at Whitegrass, Young has to be pretty...
I think it was... I think they were worrying about medical a lot.
Uh-huh.
And also, in Connorsville, my mother and my aunt's greatest thrill was to go to town and shop at Penny's, and so I think it was more my aunt,
Yeah, okay. And then, did your mom pass away there in Payson?
Yes.
Is that where? Okay.
Yes.
Okay. And she died about 1996. Is that what I'm remembering? On her stone down here in the
Yeah.
cemetery?
And Yeah, it was like Christmas Eve.
Okay.
Can I just ask, what were, after the divorce, did she express her feelings about leaving this place? Was there a strong attachment to the land?
To Whitegrass in particular.
Okay, I think so. She didn't speak very much of it. But she did take a knife and stab Dad's photo in the eye.
Well, the fact that she came back and tried to settle in Jackson, at, what did you say, Skyline? It says something about her attachment to the place.
To the Jackson Hole, yeah.
Yeah.
You know, she had lived here most of her adult life, you know.
Just one more question. When she was here before the divorce, did she participate in riding and things like that, or was she
Early on, very much so.
And she really enjoyed that?
Oh my gosh, yes. And she would usually choose a horse that was not dutable. I remember one in particular, we called him Dog Biscuit, and I suspect Dad got him because he was going to be dog food. And his problem was he was tall, but he didn't have the breadth for steer jerking, which was a very popular sport. And so when you tightened the cinch, he thought he had a steer on him, and he'd go over backwards. But Mother loved him. You just tighten the cinch very slowly.
You know, do you have any other questions about the Inga, for this Inga section?
No, she just sounds like quite an extraordinary woman.
And you know, I'd like to just review one story that I think I read in something that you sent me that seemed to kind of capture this independent, strong woman. It was in the wintertime, and she had to go into one of the buildings to get some supplies. And in order to get into the building, do you know the story I'm talking about? Why don't you tell that story?
Okay. It was this was before I started school, so I was here. Dad was gone, and a lot of the dry goods and canned goods were left in the main cabin in the large number 10 cans. And there was something that she needed, known as we did, would go into the main cabin and take it down to our house to use. And so at this point, the snow had just about totally covered the main cabin, but there was about a 2-foot crack between the eaves and the snow, and she was able to slide down into the main cabin and get whatever supplies she needed. And then she couldn't climb back up that steep and very frozen, so it moved.
The snowbank, yeah.
And so she called the dogs, and they kind of poked their heads down into the hole, and she grabbed the scruffs of their neck. They never wore collars, and of course they backed up and they pulled her out. Meanwhile, she had a preschool child left in the house down below.
Yeah, I love that story. Tell me about your earliest memories of Frank. Let's start talking about Frank right now.
Earliest memories.
In fact, let's go back before your memories. Let's go back to a story that may kind of... I think you told me about Frank flying planes in New Mexico, getting a little bit bored about flying in formation, and wanting to play chicken with a train.
Yes.
Yeah.
Do you want a brief synopsis of his very early history?
Yes.
Okay, let's start there.
Good.
And then point me in my whatever direction.
Awesome.
He was the youngest child of his mother, Mopsy, or Marion Galey. his father died before he was born of pneumonia, so he never knew a father. Mopsy felt that Frank Galey Sr. was the love of her life, and she was totally crushed at his death, and felt that her husband, the love of her life, was taken away from her, and she was given this squalling baby. So she gave the baby to her sister, Peachy, whom we called Auntie Peach, to raise. And Aunt Peachy raised him till about age 4, when Mopsy took him back. And a lot of this time she spent in Europe, and he ended up in a monastery school in Europe.
Is this a well-to-do family? I mean, how do you spend time? Okay.
Yes.
All right. East Coast money?
The Galey was Galey and Lord Clothiers, which Monsanto bought out.
Okay. Okay.
So yes, mainline Philadelphia.
Okay. Well-to-do family.
Well-to-do family. Upper echelon. So anyway, he was put in the monastery school. My impression from the little Dad talked about it was extremely difficult. They were very rigid. He did learn French, which he was very proud of. Came back to the United States, ended up in a Quaker school. I mean, talk about opposite ends of the pole.
Yeah.
Ended up going to Princeton. He managed his pocket money by playing bridge and backgammon. And then...
Now, the rumor is that he actually paid his tuition through gambling. I mean, he was such a good gambler that he was able to support himself. Is that...
I'm not sure about tuition. I know pocket money. I know that, that's the way he got funds.
Okay. Do you know what he studied at Princeton?
I haven't a clue. I'm not sure he did study it.
Do you know if he graduated from Princeton?
Absolutely not.
Okay.
I think he lasted almost 2 years, or maybe 2 years.
Okay.
And then he had a cousin, Chick Galey, that came west. And he came back west. The Marmee brought the 4 children, Mopsy, Eleanor, Henny, and Dad, to Barbie Sea Ranch for the summer. And that's where she met Harold Hammond that brought them here. So Dad was familiar with the West, and Charles Galey came west, and Dad supposedly followed him west.
Now, didn't Frank's mom marry Harold Hammond?
Yes.
Okay.
According to Ellen Dornan, whom I treasured as a friend, and when I was in Tucson, I ended up spending quite a bit of time with her. She was nearly blind at the time, and so beside hiking, I took care of her part of the time. And she told me the story that Harold Hammond was already married to a Marion, and Marion Galey wooed him away, and they were married for a very short time before he died.
Which meant that Marion, Frank's mother, inherited this property.
Yes, and she ran it herself. And then when Dad came west, he kind of helped her manage it. I don't think it was a very happy partnership.
Mother and son? Yeah.
And then when Dad went into the Army, I've got dates in the albums. And he was a cadet, he was a pilot. He stayed in the United States because of his German connection, marrying Mother. He his job was to fly navigators and teach them to navigate. And it was a relatively boring job for a very active, outgoing young man. So he found amusement. And one of the things that he used to love to tell and was, especially at night, flying out to point whatever, so the navigators could figure out where they had been, and then coming back toward base and seeing a train on a railroad track with the one headlight, and I guess the planes had one headlight. So he'd fly very low over the railroad tracks toward the train until he saw all the sparks from the brakes, and then he'd fly out.
That's a good Frank story. So how about your earliest memories of Frank? And what kind of what kind of an adopted father was he? What kind of a father was he?
On the surface, he was supportive. I remember, him reading like the Three Musketeers to me, actually in English.
Mm-hmm.
Winter nights on the ranch. I remember sitting on his lap and having him read to me. I remember as probably a toddler, him taking me up to the barn we had two teams. Molly and Queenie were a very large team, and Snip and Bess were a smaller, lighter team. And he carried me up to Molly, and she had the biggest, shiniest brown eyes, and I put my finger in her eye. And she didn't appreciate very much and scared me to death. And for about a year, I was afraid of horses.
Wow.
I remember sitting on his lap and having him read to me. I remember as probably a toddler, him taking me up to the barn we had two teams. Molly and Queenie were a very large team, and Snip and Bess were a smaller, lighter team. And he carried me up to Molly, and she had the biggest, shiniest brown eyes, and I put my finger in her eye. And she didn't appreciate very much and scared me to death. And for about a year, I was afraid of horses.
Wow.
He taught me a little bit of wiring, plumbing. I remember maybe as an 8-year-old using a skill saw to make a corner shelves for my grandparents in their cabin. And the equipment didn't have safety things on it in those days. I still have 10 fingers and 10 toes.
Could you saddle a horse? Could you shoe a horse? Did you learn?
Yes.
Did he teach you how to do all of that?
Yeah. Oh yeah. And harness, repair, tack. George Clover, who was, I believe he was a Navy SEAL, or a commando or something like that. Anyway, his hands were registered weapons because of his training, his military training. And he taught me to braid leather, all kinds of leather repair.
Even tie a bowline in a keychain?
And I still joke when I go and get lumber and tie it onto my truck, and the guys are kind of using string to tie things on, and I said, let me tie it. I said, I know this may sound naive, but if I can keep a pack on a mule, I can darn well keep it on a truck. Let me do it, please.
Yeah.
And packing horses on pack trips. Dad used me by the age I was 10 as a hand on pack trips, putting up tents, staking out the horses, packing the horses, saddling, cooking outside. it was just a real challenge when I had to learn to cook inside when I got married.
What an awesome education. What an experience to know all that
Yeah,
stuff.
and then how in the world are you going to make a living knowing that archaic stuff? We'll get there.
We'll get there. Yeah, we'll talk about how you did make
But that
a living.
always was a question, like, okay, I know all this stuff, so what?
Mhm.
You know,
Mhm.
how am I going to feed myself? Because I don't trust anybody else to.
You know, you said something in our earlier conversation, and again, this is a little bit of the negative, but you said that at age 10, you knew that Frank wouldn't stand by you.
Yes.
How did you know that at age 10? I mean, at that point, kids are really trusting, dependent upon their parents, and are really not aware. They just sort of take for granted the fact that mom and dad are always going to provide and always going
I
to...
never felt that.
Wow. What in Frank's behavior made you not feel that kind of thing?
There must have been something in his demeanor, because it was strong, and I do remember when he sold the ranch. That surprised me. But up till that point, it was like, okay, he's teaching me the wiring, the plumbing, where the pipes go, how the wood furnace works to heat the water, how to take care of the animals. A lot of doctoring of animals.
Mhm.
You know, I would sit underneath animals and soak whatever wound it was, and never have a fear of being stepped on or anything.
Oh.
Yeah, and so up to about that point, I felt I'm being groomed so that, you know, I can help my parents with this. And if one of them passes, that I can step in and be of use. And when he sold the ranch to the park, I think part of him telling me that, which just crushed me more than I have words for. He said, "Oh, you're gonna marry somebody from the East. And you're going to be gone. You don't have any interest in this." And it was like, he doesn't know me at all.
Hmm.
And so that really crushed me.
Mm-hmm.
And
How old were you then?
54, I think. Do you have the numbers on when that was sold? I'm not good on numbers.
I might have it
It
somewhere.
might be 10 to 12.
Yeah.
If it was really 54, I would have been 12.
So you would have been as
1956 is when he sold it for $165,000 and a life estate,
Right.
which meant that he got to run it until
He died.
he died.
Well, he and Mom died. He was the last one. And I remember going up to the barn, jumping on my horse. I rode bareback until I was 18, when I began to be curious about guys. And going up, and there's a really cool little grotto up on the headwaters of Stewart Creek. And my cousin came up and found me, but I was going to spend the night, at least. I wasn't sure I was coming back.
Wow. Do you know why Frank sold the place to the park?
He spent more than he made, always.
Okay.
And that's why he sold a piece to Balderson's on the north end of the ranch. He was always scrounging for money.
Okay.
And the funds, a lot of it went to booze. Not only his own, but he supplied free all the booze of all the dudes all summer long.
Yeah. Yeah.
And that's something Mother couldn't control. And every fall, to get through the winter, they would borrow from Jackson State Bank, and then during the summer, they would start paying it off.
Mm-hmm.
In the fall, they'd be borrowing again.
Mm-hmm. Mm. Wow. There's one other. Now, let me ask this. You said this, and it was kind of an interesting thing, but we didn't pursue it on the phone. You said that when Frank sold the ranch to the park, he had no more trouble from the park. Was there trouble before? Did he and the park administration?
Oh yeah,
Talk about.
He greeted them down at the gate many times with a gun rifle across the front seat and saying it was a private property.
Wow.
Well, they didn't like the open dump.
Mm-hmm.
The horses, we had a grazing permit, but the boundaries of the grazing permit weren't fenced, and you can't train a horse where it can graze and where it can't if there isn't a physical boundary. So they'd end up in Idaho sometimes, and that really wasn't a problem. But they'd also end up grazing on the nice green grass at Old Park headquarters superintendent's house. That was a major problem.
Awesome.
So, yes, there's, and then sometimes when the bears got in and killed the pigs, Dad would shoot a bear. Well, it's out of season, it's in the park. So then he'd grab all the dudes and they'd get down in here in the field and start shooting skeet. And so when the
ranger came up.
When one of the rangers came up, we're just shooting sheep. No, there wasn't any rifle shots.
Okay.
So yeah, there was conflict.
Can I just ask, this side of Frank that you're describing, was it known outside of the ranch, or did people that come here pretty much close ranks about it, or did he have a reputation in town, or how?
I think he probably had a reputation. Yeah, he didn't, he would laugh and joke about, well, I fooled the park again. But I don't know how much you know about legal things. I was trained as I call it a forest protection officer, which is kind of a half-assed police thing with the Forest Service. Where's the proof? They couldn't, and at a later date, they couldn't find the bear, they couldn't find the bullet. It's all hearsay. They don't have any proof.
Yeah.
So, it's...
Looking back, did you get the impression that there were a number of pre-Hark dude ranchers or inholders that shared that same attitude?
Oh, absolutely.
Can you talk a little bit about that?
I do know that when the park used their policy of eminent domain to, they condemned us, the Elbow Ranch, and I don't know the other one.
Not the JY?
Oh, heavens no.
Okay. Because that's the Rockefeller
right.
property? Okay.
That would not at all. But the park's direction at that point was to have no in-holdings on the west side of the river. So those three ranches did get together and countersued, and they won in as much as they had got some compensation. I believe it was the Elbow Ranch that was traded property over on the east slope, on behind Antelope Flats. Dad got some money and then had to buy back the life estate, which left enough to get Goldenrock, I guess, basically. And I'm not sure what happened to the last ranch. I'm thinking it might have been, the girls' ranch that was on Cottonwood Creek. And I can't think of the name. Miss Tarhill, I think, was her name. And I think she did get some funds and just wrapped it up.
Closed up.
So that was when Dad really started looking for a winter place and a place that they really owned.
Yeah.
And it wasn't as much trouble with the park. They started picking up the garbage at the gate, except they couldn't handle what we produced, so some of it still got buried on the property. It was just done in a quieter, unobtrusive way. Things did get a little easier.
Sort of moving towards conclusion of this Frank section, I thought you gave a very good quote, and I'll just read what I wrote here, that Frank was weak in character but strong in charisma. I think you've kind of hit that nail on the head. I'm just wondering, a lot of the dudes saw Frank and just loved him because they'd go on adventures, they'd go on pack trips, they'd go hunting, they'd go over to Phelps Lake at midnight and do all this fun stuff. Was that hard for you to kind of see both sides?
When you don't know anything else, it's normal. And it's just like I couldn't see till 4th grade. I didn't know I couldn't see. I'd never seen.
Yeah, we'll get to that.
Yeah,
next.
I know. But I mean, how can you perceive something you have no context for?
Yeah. Interesting.
You know, this is normal people. Well, I've learned in later life maybe it wasn't normal, but oh well.
It's what your normal was.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay.
Those kinds of activities that you just described Frank doing, did they tend to be gender specific in any way, or were women included on these late night rides equally?
Oh yeah. Yeah. No, I don't. I had never felt a gender difference. You know, I felt like Dad was raising me like he would a son. I mean, I remember one time, and it was like, happened many times, at one in particular, the plumbing in cabin 11, this little one that faces the mountains here, the pipes had broken, and so he was crawled, you know, it was early spring. He was down in the ice and the mud under the cabin saying, you know, hand me such and such a pipe wrench, hand me the clamp, hand me this. You know, I was included in whatever. If he, you know, perceived me as a girl, would he have me out there rolling around in the mud and the ice handing him tools also? Would he have been teaching me, you know, one of my early jobs was, you know, mucking out the barn. I much preferred it to mucking out the main cabin.
Wow.
But no, I don't think there was a gender thing in his mind.
Did you have much contact with him after he divorced your mom?
Very little. The first year that Mom was gone and Nona was here, he invited Jim, who was the father of my kids, and I to bring our trailer up here. And we actually did manage to drag it right by the main cabin kitchen, where it's sunk into the mud. and managed to get it up in the woods west of there eventually, and trying so hard to be welcoming to Nona, and going down to Dornan's, asking Bob what Dad's favorite wine would be, that this is what I was going to cook, and I was inviting them up to the trailer for dinner, and Nona was very ungracious.
Mm-hmm.
And we managed to survive that summer here with difficulty. I remember the big mixer at the main cabin went out, and I had a pretty good size for a household mixer, and I took it down to the kitchen so that at least they could feed. And going back to get it in the fall, and Nona had microphones in the barn, in the kitchen, and other places, so she knew what was going on everywhere.
Wow.
And so I was talking to Ellen, the cook, and I said, Jim and I are headed out to school, and I need the mixer. And no problem, here it is. I started out the door with the mixer under my left arm, and here comes Nona, hell-bent for leather. And, you can't steal that mixer. And I had my hand all the way wrapped back, and I was going to let go. Because she never replaced that mixer for the ranch kitchen. I thought, this isn't going to get any of us anywhere.
Mm-hmm.
I'm probably going to have a broken hand, and it just isn't going to. I just walked off. It was one of the smarter moves I've ever made in my life.
Mm-hmm. Did you leave the mixer?
Hell no. It was mine. It was given to me as a wedding gift.
You also told me that at some point, I guess were you living in Laramie, and you got a call or a letter saying, come and get your stuff.
Right. That was that winter.
Okay.
We were invited off the ranch.
Yeah.
And so in midwinter with 2 infants, we drove from Laramie up here and got what we could. It wasn't quite all, but I got some of the other later through my cousin, and went back.
You know what, Sharon, I have one more question about this Frank section. Is there something else you'd like to ask? Some burning... Then let me... the last thing I'd like you to comment on, and it's something you told me on the phone, is that Frank was loyal to blood. And then when it came to the will, to an inheritance, you got 2 saddles and a leather jacket.
A jacket.
A jacket. Okay.
A jacket that actually the cowboys took off the ranch and brought to me.
Okay. Was it Frank's jacket?
Yes, he'd left it. It was worn out, and it was left in the workshop. And the saddle was a side saddle that belonged to my grandmother.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
And after Nona, there's 2 times that Dad got Christmas gifts for us. And that was about the only contact, unless I stumbled over him in town. And I think that a lot of that had to be with his character, because if he had contact with me, he'd be in trouble at home. Mm. And when I tried to call, Nona was doing the bookkeeping. She'd be the one that answer, and I would be shut down harshly.
Okay.
So it was like, I'm not going to go there.
Yeah.
So I guess my question, Cindy, is when all this happened and you were escorted off the ranch, so to speak, what about some of the staff, the wranglers and stuff that you had built up relationships to? Did you have any sense of how they reacted to the way you were treated?
Not really. Only in as much as that they thought enough of me that they brought me those items from the barn and the workshop. Because I was neither fish nor fowl. I was not an employee, though I worked. And I wasn't a guest, even though maybe in social strata I might have been more in that strata. I was neither. Without siblings, I was a group of one. And, my primary relationships were the animals. I didn't feel it really with my parents, and I didn't feel it with a helper, and I didn't feel it with the guests. I mean, I got along with them, at least superficially. A lot of the years that I had a specific job on the ranch, it wasn't paid. It wasn't a paid job. But it didn't mean that I didn't have to produce to the same quality that Mother and Rachel expected.
Yeah. I've talked to some of the older whitegrassers, and they say that there are two distinct eras. There's the Inga era and the Nona era. They were totally opposite. And some of the Inga era tried to come back during the Nona era and couldn't do it.
Right.
Such negative emotion, or the world had just changed. And is that a fair assessment in your?
Absolutely.
Okay.
And I was probably the most persona non grata up here of anybody.
Yeah.
Could you take any of your animals with you, or was that? Did you have to leave that connection?
That's a very interesting question. I presume that the saddle that I was given was my saddle. The last horse that I had in particular that I trained from when he dropped out of the mare that was also supposedly my horse. That was a ranch horse. The ranch needed it. That was a ranch saddle. The ranch needed it.
Wow. Okay.
And my dog that Dad said that he wanted to take care of that winter that when we went to Laramie, I discovered actually was not my dog because he had the right to give him away to somebody else.
Wow. Let's talk about you. You know what? One of the things that stands out in my mind, you sent me that awesome thing that you wrote, your early memories. The thing that stands out in my mind is being cold in the wintertime. Talk about that. You lived here year round.
Yes.
Talk about that.
Our only heat was wood. The first years, we moved from one cabin to the other for winter, depending on, I guess, when guests left and what cabin would suit us or whatever. The winter in cabin 4, which is now gone, there was a couch that was built in that cabin by Harold Hammond. It was a post structure, and that was basically my playpen because it was so cold on the floor. There was no insulation on the floor. That's where I needed to stay. And then that was pushed up right next to the fireplace, which is not a good warming tool anyway. And my bedroom was the farthest away from any heat source. And I like sleeping in the cold, but I don't like getting up in the cold. Remember a winter in the Hammond cabin. This was after Marmee had died. Or Marmee may have been down in the homestead cabin, which is no longer. And that's probably it, because I think, Marmee had already moved down to the homestead cabin in winter, so we were in the Hammond cabin. and we had 2 pigs, Porky and Bess, and we fed them out the kitchen window. Mother would open the kitchen, put the scraps out, close the window. Dad tried to make gin to support his drinking habit, and almost burnt the cabin down. That was the end of that endeavor. We bathed in a tin wash tub that we put in front of the fireplace and heat water, and I was usually bathed first, Mother second, and then Dad got fresh water.
Yeah.
When
Would you bathe every day, or was it like the Saturday night
it was
bath?
kind of like the once a week, middle of
Okay.
the day,
Okay.
you know,
Okay.
kind of thing. Spit baths sponge baths in between.
Yeah.
But yeah, once a week we were bathed. I remember when the reason that the Galey house was built was, I guess, every time there was an open cabin, that's what we'd move into for X number of days or weeks. As soon as it was needed by guests, we'd do something else.
Okay.
And there were times that we actually lived in a canvas wall tent because the cabins were needed for guests or employees.
Mm-hmm.
And I guess I came back from an all-day ride and burst into one of the cabin that we had spent the last night in and greeted dudes.
Mm-hmm.
And I guess I got hysterical, and Mother put her foot down and said, okay, we need our own place. And I remember winters there that Mother would heat a water bottle and stick in the foot of the bed, and I'd crawl in, and I remember the covers being so heavy that it would just almost crush the breath out of me. And waking up in the morning and the hot water bottle would be frozen solid.
Ooh, man. Wow. You know what? How does an experience like that shape you? I mean, now as you look back, is this just made you hard as nails, or you just, man, I'm glad I don't ever have to do that again?
I think hard as nails. Yeah.
It would.
And, when I was working wilderness, well, we'll get there. But yeah, and every time that I had or perceived I had an injustice, the last person I'd go to was my parents. I got on my horse and I headed up the hills.
Mm-hmm.
And I'd sit out somewhere and watch an ant pile or watch the elk graze across a meadow or, whatever was happening out there. That was my comfort zone.
Mm-hmm.
That, animals never lie. Whatever they are, they are. You know that. They are honest, be they wild or be they domestic.
Mm-hmm.
Humans aren't that way. They have their personal agendas. They put on faces for one thing and another face for another thing.
Talk about your education. That was an interesting topic when we talked on the phone.
Yeah.
And about your eyes.
At first, we tried to commute from the ranch, getting me to a bus at Moose, and then into town, which meant I'd be leaving in the dark and I'd be coming back in the dark. And then as the winter progressed, that became untenable. And somewhere in that, my dad decided that he had to build a townhouse and bought the 2 little log cabins and put them together. And So I started school in town, and I was a loner. I was a ranch kid. Most of the other ranch kids that I was aware of, like the Turners, they lived in Salt Lake City in the wintertime. So the family was there. The kids went to school there. They were at home there and here. Whereas my only home was really Whitegrass. And so being a ranch kid, I was much more a ranch kid than them because they had that other half a year of experience. And I didn't get along. Where would I have learned to get along with anybody? Because on the ranch, the help was here for, 3 months?
Mm-hmm.
You can get along with anybody for 3 months. I mean, this isn't hard. The guests were here for a few weeks to a month, and they were gone. I didn't have to learn to get along with anybody.
Yeah.
And with my parents being very busy with business, I didn't even really have a whole lot of interaction with them. So when I started school, it was a shock.
Mm-hmm.
And I remember being attempted rape. I remember being shot in the butt with a BB gun.
Welcome to school, right? And this is all grade school.
Yeah.
Oh my gosh.
And then, like I said, about 6th grade, my parents started looking for winter places. And so I went to boarding school in Salt Lake City.
At Roland Hall.
At Roland Hall. And then I was actually not only having to get along with people, I had to live with them. And Aunt Henry, who was the house mother, decided that, there's these 2 single kids, they'll have a lot in common, so they put us in the same room together.
Is this in Salt Lake?
Salt Lake City.
Roland Hall? Okay.
Yeah. So I chose the side of the room with the window, and Barbara chose the side with the door. It's the 2nd story. And that worked out really fine till I had to go to the bathroom. And then we had a knockdown drag out, and I was on top because I've been working with horses, and she's been playing in the city. And they said, okay, maybe we better put Cindy in a single room. And that was much more manageable. And I did start learning to get along with people. But my values, having helped horses foal, cows calve, watching chicks being hatched, what color lipstick, whether I wear a plaid skirt or a blue skirt, just wasn't anywhere in the horizon of what I felt was important.
Yeah.
So did I fit in? Not at all.
Yeah.
I didn't, except for that first fight. I was told I better not fight again. Okay, I won't fight again. It didn't mean I wasn't picked on. I remember that doesn't mean they couldn't pick on me.
Mm-hmm.
And I remember one incident that I don't know what kicked it off, but they were dragging me up and down the hallway by my hair, and I just was deadpan. Well, that was no fun. They left me alone. It worked.
It worked. Tell us about your eyes and 4th grade.
Okay.
What everybody learned in 4th grade.
Mr. Ellingson was the teacher, and somehow, even though I was G, which is relatively close to the beginning of the alphabet, I seemed to be in the back of the room. And all my school years, the teacher was up there waving his hands or her hands and talking to us, and, I could grasp what they were saying. And he discovered, he moved me up to the front of the room. They weren't waving their hands, they were drawing on a board.
Yeah.
And about that same time, Mother and Dad picked me up at Moose, and we were coming back after school. And it was the fall, and Mom said, "Oh, look at the elk." And I said, Where, what elk? She said, "Up by the aspen trees." And I said, "What aspen trees?" And Mother turned around to hit me because she thought I was sassing in the back seat. And of course, I cowered. And all of a sudden she looked at Dad and said, "Oh my God, Frank, that child can't see." And so I got glasses, which got changed 2 to 3 times or 4 times a year.
Because?
Now, I was just 12. My eyes were changing so much, but also I was a roughneck,
Mm-hmm.
you know.
I thought it was Wild Indian. Who said that?
Oh, Balderson's.
Yeah, okay.
Balderson said I rode like a wild Indian.
Okay. So you're always breaking your glasses?
Yeah. and my prescription was changing constantly, too. Yeah, and then from knowing this territory without glasses, because I could get anywhere and I could get home, you know, way up, you know, and up to the rock bases, basically, in these mountains by myself, bareback with a horse. I had a whole system of finding my way around, and even people that would walk in the house, by their mannerisms, by their voice, I knew who they were. I didn't see their faces. I mean, I'd see a light and gray, but you know, it's.
Yeah.
And when I got my glasses, it was really frightening. There were leaves on trees. Just so much detail that it was overwhelming. And at times I'd be out and I wouldn't know where I was. I'd have to take my glasses off to figure out where I was.
Wow.
And I'd have to relearn all my people because now they had faces.
That is wild. You did grades 6 through 9 in Salt Lake. Then you went to Massachusetts for the rest of high school, 10 through 12.
Yes.
Right? And then, here's an interesting thing. I think you said you were sent to Philadelphia to go to secretary school or business school.
Yes.
Talk about that. And you wanted to be a vet. So let's kind of talk about your career path to a certain point.
Okay.